I have said it many times on this channel. Long exposures are a great way to reduce chaos and make our subject pop. Unfortunately, with the wrong conditions, it makes it hard to shoot a proper long exposure, as we will end up with blurry objects in the frame. For example, this was a wonderful sunset, but at the same time, the wind caused the water to move a lot, and which in turn made the boat shake, and I ended up with a blurry subject. As another example, moving objects are also a huge problem when shooting waterfall scenes in the forest around trees, because tree branches like to move a lot as well. So how can we still shoot long exposures but prevent certain objects from becoming blurry? There are 3 steps to this. First, we will shoot our long exposure as usual. Then we take another shot from the same angle with different camera settings. Finally, we blend both images together in Photoshop with just a little bit of masking. Let's take a look at this scene for example. We have this nice waterfall and we want to make the water look silky smooth by using longer shutter speeds. Let's say something around 1 second maybe. In the areas surrounding the waterfall, we do have a lot of things that could potentially move around in the wind. Small side note, for this particular scene and day, there actually wasn't much movement, but I still want to show you the process behind this technique. Once we got the long exposure shot, we need to adjust the camera settings to get our second image. For that we need to shoot from the same position, so don't move around the camera. And since we are already shooting long exposures in the first place, that means we have to use a tripod anyway. So that of course makes it a lot easier. To adjust the camera settings, I first dropped the shutter speed to something like 1/40th of a second. While I drop the shutter speed, I count the stops it takes to get to the new setting. So I carefully operate the shutter speed wheel while counting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on. Let's say it takes 5 stops to get to the desired shutter speed. With that number in mind, we can now adjust the aperture or the ISO to bring back the exposure to the exact same spot as before with the longer shutter speed. In this case, I simply opened up the aperture 5 stops. Now we have 2 images. One with a longer shutter speed for a silky smooth waterfall, and one with a shorter shutter speed to freeze motion of objects surrounding our subject. But both images are roughly the same when it comes to the brightness. Because we made the image 5 stops darker dialing in a shorter shutter speed, then countering that we made the image 5 stops brighter by opening up the aperture. This is important when blending the 2 images later in Photoshop to make the blend seamless with no differences in brightness between both shots. If you don't want to change the aperture, of course, this also works by readjusting the ISO. Or you could use a variable ND filter using the stronger setting for the longer exposure and reducing the ND filter strength for the shorter exposure. In this case, I'm using a magnetic polarizer plus variable ND filter combo from Freewell. So now we have 2 images which we need to blend in Photoshop. The cool thing here is that this also works with HDR, as I will be showing in the upcoming example. And you could also use focus stacking if you have anything close in the foreground. Getting it right the first time, especially when combining multiple different techniques like HDR or focus stacking, might require some practice. Learning more about photography in general and understanding how your camera works will speed up this process. Skillshare, the sponsor of this video, is a great place to dive deeper into the photography world. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with a wide range of topics from photography to illustration, graphic design, marketing, productivity, and much more. There are thousands of creative classes ranging from beginner to advanced, taught by industry experts who share their tools and techniques with the members. For example, I was able to learn a lot of useful things in regards of video production in the YouTube class by Marques Brownlee, which not only helps improving this channel, but it also helps me with the customers I work with outside of YouTube. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today. Now that we're done with the photography part, let's also take a look at the editing process and how we can blend the two different exposures together. Here we are in the Camera Raw editor because, as always, we have to do the raw adjustments first. Down below you can see 6 images. That's because we're working with HDR sequences. So the first 3 images will be merged into the HDR for the long exposure, and the next 3 images will be the HDR for the shorter exposure. I'm going through the editing real quick, so let's do this. I'm merging the first HDR image, selecting all 3 of them, right-click and choose Merge to HDR. Without changing anything, I'm hitting the Merge button right away. And let's do the same for our shorter exposure. Again, let's select the 3 images, right-click, Merge to HDR. I'm not changing anything again, just hit Merge button. Alright, with the merging of the HDR out of the way, we can now start the basic raw adjustments, and I'm going through these settings real quick. I'm changing the profile to Adobe Landscape for more saturation. Then let's open up the light panel. Here we want to adjust the exposure, making it look a bit brighter. So I'm going to bring up the exposure overall, just around here. I don't want to overdo it to lose details in the highlights. Then I'm going to bring down the highlights quite a bit, since these are kind of clipping already, and this will make the whole shot darker. So to counter that, I am going to bring up the blacks just around here. I do think I want to bring up the exposure quite a bit more, because we are still not seeing much in this image, but right around here looks great. I also do want to bring up the whites just a little bit. Looking at Instagram, you can see we can safely do that without overexposing. And then let's add a bit of contrast as well. Okay, then I'm also going to adjust the colors a bit, mainly the white balance, because right now you can see a very heavy blue color cast, and that's not what we want. We want to give this image some more of a golden hour light saturation, so I'm going to bring up the temperature here. And this is looking perfect. I'm also going to bring up the vibrance for some more saturation. And then let's open up the effects panel. Here I want to increase the texture, giving the image just some more sharpness. At the same time, I want to apply some kind of autumn glow effect, so I'm going to drop the clarity, which makes everything softer. I could also drop the dehaze for a stronger autumn glow effect. However, I think I want to go with the opposite. I'm going to increase the dehaze, which will add some more contrast and just gives the image more punch overall. And that's looking good so far. Now let's also do a little bit of masking. There's not much going on, however. I want to start using a radial gradient covering pretty much the center of the image, which I think needs to be a little brighter. So I'm going to bring up the exposure. I am also going to bring up the shadows. Let's further drop the highlights in this area. And I do think I want to add some more contrast as well. Okay, let's also increase the temperature in here. Just a little bit to fix the blues of the water. And I'm going to add texture and some clarity to give this area some more punch in particular. Alright, then I want to work on the waterfall real quick. I'm going to use a color range mask for that. I'm clicking somewhere in the blue part of the waterfall around here. Of course, we are selecting way more than needed, so let's subtract a linear gradient, removing that mask from the top like this. And I'm also going to subtract from the bottom part. And I want to subtract the right part of the waterfall, because this part of it is already way too bright, so we don't need to adjust this area. What I want to do with the rest is to simply bring up the exposure, making the whole waterfall a little bit brighter this way. And that's it for the masking. Now let's do a little bit of color grading before we can start to blend the images. I'm going to head into the color mixer. I want to bring up the saturation of these warmer autumn tones, so orange, yellow, and green. Then I also want to adjust the hue a bit. Therefore, let's drop the orange hue, which will make the orange tones of the image look a bit more red. I am also going to drop the yellow hue And I am going to increase the green hue just so we get some more color variety in this image. Perfect. That's it for the color mixer. I'm skipping the color grading because there's no need for split toning for this scene. However, I want to head into the calibration tab and bring down the blue primary hue gently and raise the saturation quite a bit to make this image colorful. Wonderful. Then we could also sharpen this image in the details tab, bring down the radius, increase the details, add some masking while holding down the Alt key and apply the sharpening. Done. So these were the raw adjustments for our long exposure HDR. Now we need to copy these settings to our shorter exposure image. So I'm selecting the second HDR right down below in the film strip, then right click and choose synchronize settings. Here make sure to check all so every setting will be copied over to the second image and hit OK. Now this is our long exposure. And this is the shorter exposure. You can see the difference in the water pretty clearly. What you also can see is we do have the exact same exposure. That's why it was really important to count the stops we have adjusted with the shutter speed earlier in the process. Now, with these two images, we can start blending them together. So select both of them and click Open Objects. I'm going to hit Ctrl A to select everything, and then I'm going to hit Ctrl C to copy this area, go to the long exposure image and hit Ctrl V to pass the image as a layer above. So now we have both images in one single Photoshop file, and now we can start the blending process. Let me show you some details of the long exposure shot. Of course, the waterfall looks nice and smooth with that long exposure effect. But also some of these tree branches are very slightly moving around, and this will lead to a blurry effect. You can see it once I turn on the shorter exposure, it just looks a lot sharper. Now what we want to do is we want to apply a layer mask. Actually, we want to apply a black layer mask. So hold down the Alt key and click the layer mask icon with the shorter exposure layer selected. This creates a black layer mask on our short exposure. Now I'm grabbing the brush by pressing B, set the foreground color to white, and now what I'm going to do is I'm brushing over all areas where I want the image to be sharper with a short exposure. So right around here, I'm going to brush over this area, and thus I'm making this part of the image way sharper. I'm also going to brush over the leaves right here, everything that could move which doesn't need the motion blur effect. And that's the basics of it. So with this technique we are blending two different exposures to create the sharpest possible outcome. Now this was an example for a long exposure waterfall scene, but I can also show you something else. So here we have another long exposure. Most of the times boats on water are moving around very slightly, as you can see right here. We end up with a very blurry subject, and also the tree branches in the upper left corner are not sharp. That's why I shot this second exposure to fix that. However, deactivating this layer, you can see the boat is moving around quite a bit, so we cannot just use a mask over the boat to fix that. First, what I'm doing is I'm removing that boat from the long exposure layer. I'm going to use the lasso tool for that. I'm just going to create a very rough selection here around it. And now let's hit generative fill and hit generate. As you can see, generative fill is doing a great job at removing that boat. So now we can start blending in the shorter exposure. Again, we want to start with a black layer mask, so hold on the Alt key and click the layer mask icon. Then let's grab the brush tool, set the foreground color to white, and now I'm just brushing over this area right here. And it will be nicely blended since we have the exact same exposure, just like this. Of course, now we can see some waves right here in the back. That just means I need to mask a little more precisely. Just something like this looks perfect. Now we have a sharp boat with a long exposure combined in the background and the rest of the water. And also we can take a look at the leaves. Again, I'm just brushing over this layer mask right here. And just like this, we are getting back those sharp looking leaves for our long exposure. Perfect. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial on how to create this sharp looking long exposure effects. So if you have any questions left or want to add anything, let me know in the comments of this video. And thank you so much for watching.